Millionaire shocked to see his childhood first love selling lemonade, and then does the unthinkable. Sometimes fate has a twisted sense of humor. The boy who promised to come back for you becomes a millionaire while you're counting quarters from a lemonade stand. But what happens when 16 years of silence, success, and survival collide over 50 cents and a paper cup filled with childhood memories? The Arizona sun beat down on Mill Avenue like a relentless judge, turning the asphalt into waves of shimmering heat that made Phoenix feel more like purgatory than paradise. Scott Turner adjusted his tie as he stepped out of the air-conditioned sanctuary of Morrison Associates' downtown office, the weight of another successful acquisition heavy on his shoulders despite the victory it represented. At 34, Scott commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 states, his private equity firm specializing in turning failing businesses into profitable enterprises. The Midas touch, they called it, in Forbes magazine. Everything Scott Turner touched turned to gold, except for the one thing that had always mattered most. His phone buzzed with congratulations from investors. Another 8-figure deal closed before lunch. But as Scott walked toward his Porsche, the familiar emptiness crept in. Success felt hollow when there was no one who remembered the scared kid from Sunshine Manor foster home. No one who knew that beneath the Armani suits and Swiss watches lived a boy who'd once promised a girl he'd come back for her when he had enough money to take care of them both. The black Porsche purred to life, its leather interior a stark contrast to the heat outside. Scott had been planning to drive straight home to his Scottsdale mansion to spend another evening alone in his infinity pool, reviewing acquisition targets and pretending that building an empire was enough to fill the Scott-shaped hole in his life. But traffic forced him down Mill Avenue, through the college district, where Arizona State students congregated in coffee shops and vintage stores, their young faces bright with the kind of hope Scott remembered having once, a lifetime ago. That's when he saw her. The lemonade stand was impossibly modest. A card table covered with a yellow tablecloth, a hand-painted sign that read, "Evelyn's Fresh Lemonade 050, and behind it, a woman whose face Scott would have recognized in a crowd of thousands. Evelyn Martinez, his first love, his first everything, the girl who'd held his hand through thunderstorms at the group home, who'd shared her last candy bar when his food stamps ran out, who'd kissed him for the first time behind the gymnasium when they were both 16, and convinced they could conquer the world together. Scott's hands trembled as he pulled to the curb, his mind reeling with 16 years of guilt and longing and questions that had no easy answers. She looked older, of course, her dark curls now contained by a practical ponytail, her face showing the kind of weariness that came from too many early mornings and late nights. But her eyes were the same warm brown that had been his refuge during the worst years of his childhood. She hadn't seen him yet, focused instead on a young boy who sat beside her, around 7 years old, coloring in a workbook while she served a customer. The child had her eyes and her smile, and Scott felt something crack open in his chest at the realization that Evelyn had built a life he knew nothing about. "Mama, can I have a popsicle?" the boy asked, his voice carrying the slight lisp of missing teeth. "After we sell more cups, baby," Evelyn replied, her voice holding the same gentle strength Scott remembered. "Maybe tonight we can get those grape ones you like." Scott sat in his car for 10 minutes, air conditioning running, watching the woman who'd shaped his entire understanding of love serve lemonade to college students and construction workers. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to drive away, to preserve the beautiful memory of what they'd been rather than confront the reality of what they'd become. But then a gust of wind knocked over Evelyn's sign, and without thinking, Scott was out of the car. "Let me help with that," he said, reaching for the fallen poster board. Evelyn looked up, and time stopped. Scott watched recognition dawn in her eyes like sunrise breaking over the desert. First confusion, then shock, then something that might have been joy before it was quickly replaced by something more complicated. "Scott?" Her voice was barely a whisper, as if saying his name too loudly might make him disappear like a mirage. "Hello, Evie." The childhood nickname slipped out before he could stop it, and he saw her flinch slightly at the intimacy of it. They stared at each other across the card table while the city moved around them, 16 years of silence stretching between them like a canyon neither knew how to cross. Mama! The little boy looked up from his coloring book, sensing the tension in his mother's sudden stillness. Who's the man in the fancy clothes? Evelyn's eyes never left Scott's face as she answered. This is Scott, baby. An old friend of Mama's. From before I was born? Marcus asked, with the directness that only children possessed. From long before you were born, Evelyn confirmed, her voice carefully neutral. Scott knelt down to the boy's level, his expensive suit forgotten in the dust of the sidewalk. What's your name, buddy? Marcus Antonio Martinez, the boy replied formally, then grinned. But everyone calls me Mark. I'm 7 3/4 and I'm really good at math. Want to see? Before Scott could answer, Mark had launched into an explanation of his coloring book, which turned out to be filled with addition and subtraction problems. Mama says learning is the most important thing. Even when we're working, she teaches me stuff while we make lemonade. Scott glanced up at Evelyn, seeing the pride and exhaustion warring in her expression. That's very smart of your mama. She's the smartest person in the whole world, Mark said, with the absolute certainty of a child's love. She knows how to fix cars and make medicine taste good, and she can sing every Disney song ever made. I bet she can, Scott said softly, remembering the girl who'd sung him to sleep during his worst nightmares, who'd tutored him in subjects she'd barely passed herself because she believed in his potential more than he did. Mark, why don't you go get us some more ice from the cooler in the van? Evelyn said, clearly needing a moment alone with Scott. But Mama, strangers aren't supposed to... Scott's not a stranger, baby. He's... Evelyn hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't require explanations she wasn't ready to give. He's family, sort of. Mark studied Scott with the serious consideration of a child deciding whether to trust an adult. Whatever he saw in Scott's face must have satisfied him, because he nodded and trotted toward a battered Honda van parked nearby. Family? Scott asked once they were alone. Evelyn's cheeks flushed slightly. You know what I meant. Foster kids don't have traditional categories for relationships. No, we don't. Scott stood, brushing dust from his knees, acutely aware of how overdressed he was for this reunion. Evie, what are you doing here? I mean, I can see what you're doing, but why am I selling lemonade instead of running my own corporation? The edge in her voice was sharp enough to cut. Not all of us were blessed with your particular talents, Scott. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? Evelyn began aggressively wiping down the already clean table, her movements sharp with barely contained emotion. You're not the first person to drive by in an expensive car and wonder how I ended up here. Scott felt the conversation slipping away from him before it had really begun. I've been looking for you, for years. Evelyn's hands stilled on the tablecloth. What? I hired private investigators. I checked social media, alumni databases, anything I could think of. I even went back to Sunshine Manor, but they said they couldn't give out information about former residents. You looked for me? Her voice was small, vulnerable in a way that reminded Scott painfully of the girl she'd been. I promised I'd come back when I had enough money to take care of both of us. I know it took longer than either of us expected, but I kept my promise. I came back. Evelyn stared at him, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Scott, that was 16 years ago. We were kids making promises we couldn't possibly understand. I understood perfectly. I loved you, Evie. I never stopped. Don't. The word was sharp, final. Don't you dare finish that sentence. Not here, not like this. Mark returned with the ice, sensing the tension, but attributing it to adult mysteries beyond his comprehension. Is Mr. Scott gonna buy some lemonade? It's really good. Mama puts real lemons in it, not the fake stuff. Scott reached for his wallet, extracting a $100 bill before he remembered where he was. Evelyn's eyes fixed on the money with an expression that made Scott feel like he'd just slapped her. I don't need your charity, she said quietly. It's not charity. It's payment for services rendered. Scott held the bill out to Mark instead. 1 cup of lemonade, and keep the change for being such a good salesman. Mark's eyes went wide. Mama, is this real? It has Benjamin Franklin on it. It's real, baby, but we can't... Why not? Scott interrupted gently. Mark did excellent work explaining the product. He deserves to be compensated fairly. Evelyn looked trapped between pride and practicality, between the bills she needed to pay and the dignity she needed to maintain. Scott saw the moment she made her choice, saw her shoulders square with the kind of resignation that came from having fought too many losing battles. "Thank you," she said formally, as if Scott were any other customer. "Mark, pour Mr. Scott some lemonade." The drink was perfect, tart and sweet and somehow tasting like childhood summers when anything felt possible. Scott drank it slowly, trying to make the moment last, trying to find words that would bridge the gap between who they'd been and who they'd become. "Evie," he said finally, "I know this is awkward, but I'd like to talk. Really talk. Not here, not like this, but somewhere we can—" "There's nothing to talk about," Evelyn said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You found me, Scott. Mission accomplished. You can go back to your life knowing you kept your promise." "That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about? Because from where I'm sitting, you're a successful businessman who stumbled across his charity case from the foster system. You bought some overpriced lemonade, you can feel good about helping the less fortunate, and now you can move on with your life." The bitterness in her voice was devastating, but Scott recognized it for what it was: protection, the same walls he'd built around his own heart to keep people from getting close enough to hurt him. "You're right," he said quietly. "I am successful. I have more money than I know what to do with. Houses I've never lived in, cars I barely drive. But do you know what I don't have, Evie?" She didn't answer, but he could see her listening despite herself. "I don't have anyone who knew me before I had all of this. I don't have anyone who remembers that I used to be afraid of thunderstorms, or that I couldn't sleep without checking the locks twice, or that I cried for 3 days when Mrs. Henderson found me that home with the Collins family." Evelyn's expression softened slightly at the mention of their shared past. "I don't have anyone who loved me when I had nothing to offer except myself," Scott continued. "Everyone in my life now met me after I'd already become successful. They love what I can provide, not who I am underneath all of this." He gestured at his expensive clothes, his luxury car, the trappings of success that felt more like costume than identity. "That's a very pretty speech," Evelyn said, but her tone had lost some of its edge. "But 16 years is a long time, Scott. People change. I'm not the girl you remember, and you're obviously not the boy I knew." "Maybe not," Scott agreed, "but maybe that's okay. Maybe we can get to know who we are now." Before Evelyn could respond, Mark tugged on her sleeve. "Mama, I'm hungry. Can we go home soon?" The interruption broke the spell of their conversation, returning them both to the reality of the hot sidewalk and the practical needs of a 7-year-old boy. Scott saw Evelyn glance at the small stack of bills in her cash box, saw her calculate whether they'd made enough for dinner. "I should let you get back to your day," Scott said, understanding that this wasn't the time or place for the conversation they both needed to have. "But Evie, this doesn't have to be goodbye again." He pulled out his business card, writing his personal number on the back before handing it to her. "When you're ready to talk, if you're ever ready, call me. Please." Evelyn took the card without looking at it, slipping it into her pocket like evidence of a crime. "Scott, no pressure," he said quickly. "No expectations. Just, if you ever want to catch up, or if you ever need anything, I'm here. I'll always be here." He started walking back to his car, then stopped and turned around. "For what it's worth, Evie, I think you did an amazing job with Mark. He's lucky to have you as his mama." As Scott drove away, he watched Evelyn in his rearview mirror, standing behind her lemonade stand with her son, looking like everything he'd ever wanted and everything he'd convinced himself he could never have. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with messages about another deal, another opportunity to add zeros to his already obscene net worth. But all Scott could think about was the taste of lemonade and the way Evelyn's eyes had softened when he'd mentioned their shared past. Some promises took 16 years to keep, but that didn't make them any less sacred. And some loves, Scott was beginning to realize, were worth waiting for, no matter how long it took to find your way back to them. Have you ever run into someone from your past and realized how much you've both changed? Sometimes the people who shaped us most are the ones we lost touch with along the way. Share your story of unexpected reunions in the comments below. 3 days passed in careful silence. Scott found himself driving down Mill Avenue every morning on his way to work, slowing as he passed the spot where Evelyn's lemonade stand had been. The sidewalk looked impossibly empty without her yellow tablecloth and hand-painted sign, just another stretch of concrete in a city full of forgotten dreams. He'd memorized her business card, the phone number he'd written in his own handwriting, now sitting on his office desk like an accusation. 3 times he'd picked up his phone to call her. 3 times he'd set it back down, paralyzed by the fear that hearing her voice again would either save him or destroy him completely. "You're distracted," said Janet Morrison, his business partner, as she reviewed the quarterly report spread across his conference table. "The Henderson acquisition should have your full attention, but you've been staring out that window for 20 minutes. Scott forced his gaze back to the financial documents, but the numbers blurred together like meaningless symbols. "Just thinking through some details." "Details about a lemonade stand?" Scott's head snapped up. "What?" Janet's smile was knowing and slightly amused. "You think I don't notice things? You've been carrying around a business card for 3 days, checking your phone every 5 minutes, and yesterday you asked me to research funding opportunities for small food service businesses. Either you're having a midlife crisis or you met someone. It's complicated." "The best things usually are." Janet closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. "Want to talk about it?" Scott considered deflecting, maintaining the professional distance he'd perfected over the years. But the weight of carrying Evelyn's memory alone had become unbearable, and Janet had been more than a business partner. She'd been his friend through every major decision for the past 8 years. "I knew her before," he said finally. "Before any of this. We grew up together in foster care." Janet's expression shifted from curiosity to understanding. Scott rarely talked about his childhood, but she'd picked up enough pieces over the years to know it hadn't been easy. "And now she's running a lemonade stand." "She's surviving," Scott corrected, his voice sharper than he'd intended. "There's a difference." "I'm not judging, Scott. I'm trying to understand why you're torturing yourself instead of just calling her. Because I don't know what to say." "Hi, remember me? I became rich while you're struggling to pay for groceries. Want to be friends?" Scott ran his hands through his hair, destroying the careful styling that had cost more than most people made in a day. "She looked at me like I was everything wrong with the world, or like you were everything she'd lost." The observation hit home harder than Scott cared to admit. "It doesn't matter. 16 years is a long time. People change. Priorities change. She has a son now, a life I don't understand. So learn to understand it. It's not that simple." "Why not?" Janet's tone carried the no-nonsense directness that had made her one of Phoenix's most successful attorneys. "You're brilliant at analyzing complex situations and finding solutions. What makes this different?" "Because this matters," Scott said quietly. "Every deal we've ever closed, every company we've acquired. If I fail, I lose money. If I fail with Evelyn, I lose the only person who ever saw me as more than my bank account." Janet was quiet for a moment, absorbing the raw honesty in Scott's admission. "Maybe the question isn't whether you'll fail. Maybe it's whether you're brave enough to try." That evening, Scott stood in the wine cellar of his Scottsdale mansion, surrounded by bottles worth more than most people's annual salaries, and tried to remember the last time he'd felt genuine hunger. Not for food, but for connection, for purpose, for the feeling that his life mattered to someone other than his accountants and board members. His phone rang, interrupting his brooding. Unknown number, local area code. "Scott Turner," he answered automatically. "Mr. Scott?" The voice was young, uncertain. "This is Mark, from the lemonade stand. My mama gave me your number." Scott's heart stopped. "Mark, is everything okay? Is your mom all right?" She's crying. But she says they're good tears, so I think that means she's okay." Mark's voice carried the confusion of a child trying to understand adult emotions. "She said I could call you because you're family, sort of." "What happened, buddy?" "We went to the hospital today for my checkup, and the doctor said my medicine is working really good, but now we need different medicine that costs more money." Mark's words rushed together in the way children spoke when they were repeating information they didn't fully understand. Mama tried to sell more lemonade today, but it was really hot and not many people wanted to buy any. Scott felt something cold settle in his stomach. Is your mama there? Can I talk to her? She's in the bathroom. She said she needed a minute to think about stuff. Mark's voice dropped to a whisper. Mr. Scott, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you really rich, like Mama said? The question was so innocently direct that Scott almost laughed. Yes, Mark, I am. Rich enough to help people who need help? Yes. Even if they're too proud to ask for help themselves. The wisdom in the 7-year-old's question nearly broke Scott's heart. Especially then. Good, Mark said with satisfaction. Because Mama needs help. But she won't ask for it because she says that would make her feel like she was using you for your money instead of caring about you as a person. Scott closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation Mark had just laid out with devastating simplicity. Mark, can you tell me your address? I'd like to come see you and your mama. I think she'd like that, but maybe don't come in your fancy car. It makes her feel bad about our van. 20 minutes later, Scott stood outside a modest apartment complex in central Phoenix, having borrowed Janet's Honda Civic and changed into jeans and a plain t-shirt, the most casual clothes he owned. The building was clean but tired, the kind of place where people worked hard to make ends meet and fell just short of their goals. Mark opened the door before Scott could knock, his face bright with the excitement of a child who'd successfully solved an adult problem. You came, and you look more regular now. More regular? Like a regular person instead of someone from TV. Mark grabbed Scott's hand and pulled him into the small apartment. Mama, Mr. Scott is here, and he looks normal. The apartment was tiny but immaculate, every surface clean and organized with the precision of someone who couldn't afford to waste anything. Children's artwork covered the refrigerator. Homework assignments were stacked neatly on a small dining table, and the air smelled like something delicious simmering on the stove. Evelyn emerged from what must have been the bathroom, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. She changed from her lemonade stand clothes into worn jeans and an oversized sweater, looking younger and more vulnerable than she had on the street. I can't believe he called you, she said, shooting a look at Mark that mixed exasperation with affection. I told him you were busy with important business things. This is important business, Scott said simply. Mark told me about the hospital visit. Evelyn's face went carefully blank, the same expression Scott remembered from their childhood when she was trying to hide pain or fear. It's not your problem. Maybe not. But it's your problem and your... Scott hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't make her feel like charity. You're important to me, Evie. You always have been. Scott, please don't. I can't... Mama, Mark interrupted, tugging on Evelyn's sweater. Remember what you always tell me about accepting help from family. Evelyn looked down at her son, who was watching the adult conversation with the serious attention of a child who understood more than anyone gave him credit for. That's different, baby. Why? Because... Evelyn glanced at Scott, then back at Mark, clearly struggling to explain the complicated dynamics of pride and poverty and past relationships to a 7-year-old. Because grown-up friendships are more complicated than that. But you said Mr. Scott is family, sort of, Mark persisted with the relentless logic of childhood. And you said family helps family, even when it's hard to ask. Scott knelt down to Mark's level, understanding that the real conversation was happening through the wisdom of a child who saw the world in simpler, clearer terms than the adults around him. Mark, your mama is right that grown-up friendships can be complicated. But you know what I think? What? I think the best friendships are the ones where people help each other without keeping score, where you don't worry about who owes what, you just care about making sure everyone is okay. Mark nodded solemnly. Like how Mama always shares her food, even when we don't have very much. Exactly like that. Scott glanced up at Evelyn, who was watching the exchange with an expression he couldn't quite read. And sometimes, when someone you care about is in trouble, helping them isn't about the money. It's about love. Are you in love with my mama? Mark asked with the devastating directness that only children possessed. The question hung in the air like a challenge, impossible to answer honestly, without revealing truths Scott wasn't sure he was ready to acknowledge. But looking at Evelyn's face, seeing the hope and fear warring in her expression, he realized that some truths couldn't wait for perfect timing. "I was," Scott said quietly, his eyes on Evelyn's face. "A long time ago, and seeing her again, it's reminded me that some feelings don't fade just because time passes." Evelyn's breath caught audibly, her hand moving to her throat in a gesture Scott remembered from their teenage years. Something she did when she was overwhelmed by emotion she didn't know how to process. "Scott," she whispered, his name carrying 16 years of longing and loss, and the possibility of something neither of them had dared to hope for. "I know it's complicated," Scott continued, standing but keeping his distance, respecting the invisible barriers she'd built around herself. "I know we're different people now, with different lives and responsibilities. But Evie, I need you to know that everything I've built, everything I've accomplished, none of it means anything without someone to share it with. You can't just walk back into my life, and I'm not asking to walk back in, I'm asking for permission to be part of your life going forward, however that looks, whatever that means." Scott's voice was steady despite the way his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Let me help with Mark's medical bills, not as charity, not as some grand gesture, but as someone who cares about both of you and has the resources to make this problem disappear." "I can't let you do that." "Why not?" "Because..." Evelyn struggled for words, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. "Because I spent years convincing myself that you'd forgotten about me, that our promises didn't matter, that love was just something kids say when they don't understand how the world really works. And if I let you help now, if I let myself believe that maybe we could what? Maybe we could have what we dreamed about when we were 16 and stupid and thought love could conquer everything." The admission hung between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they were brave enough to cross. Scott could see the fear in Evelyn's eyes, the terror of hoping for something that felt too good to be true, too dangerous to want. "We're not 16 anymore," Scott said gently. "We're adults who've both learned that love doesn't conquer everything. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is that some things are worth fighting for, even when you're scared. And if it doesn't work, if we try and fail and end up hurting each other, then we'll survive it, just like we survived everything else." Scott took a careful step closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "But Evie, what if it does work? What if everything we've been through, all the pain and loss and years of searching for something that felt like home, what if it all led us back to each other?" Before Evelyn could answer, Mark tugged on both their hands, pulling them into a makeshift circle in the middle of the small living room. "I think you should try," he said seriously, "because Mama's been sad for as long as I can remember, and Mr. Scott seems sad too, even though he has lots of money, and maybe if you're sad together you won't be sad anymore." The simplicity of a child's logic cut through 16 years of complicated emotions and adult fears, leaving Scott and Evelyn staring at each other across the space of a breath, a heartbeat, a decision that could change everything. "Okay," Evelyn whispered finally, her voice so quiet Scott almost didn't hear it. "Okay. Let's try." The first month felt like learning to breathe underwater. Scott had quietly taken care of Mark's medical bills, working through the hospital's financial department to ensure the payments appeared as insurance coverage rather than charity. Evelyn never asked how he'd managed it, and Scott never volunteered the details. Some gifts were better received when they didn't feel like gifts at all. But the money was the easy part. Rebuilding a relationship with someone who'd known you before you knew yourself, that required a different kind of courage. They started slowly, carefully. Coffee dates while Mark was at school, conversations that danced around the edges of deeper truths. Scott learned that Evelyn had finished community college with honors, that she'd been married briefly to a man who'd disappeared when Mark's medical needs became expensive, that she'd been working 3 jobs before the lemonade stand became her last resort. Evelyn learned that Scott's success hadn't brought him happiness, that he'd never married because no one had ever made him feel the way she had, that he'd kept every letter she'd written him during their last year in foster care, even though her forwarding address had led to dead ends when he'd tried to find her. "You kept my letters?" Evelyn asked one afternoon, as they sat in a small cafe near Mark's school, waiting for dismissal time. "Everyone." Scott stirred his coffee absently, embarrassed by the admission. "I know it sounds pathetic, but they were the only proof I had that what we felt was real." "It was real," Evelyn said quietly. "It's just complicated now." "Because of Mark?" "Because of everything." Evelyn watched through the window as children began emerging from the school building, her eyes scanning for her son's familiar backpack. "You say you want to be part of our lives, Scott, but I don't think you understand what that means." "Then explain it to me." "It means PTA meetings and soccer practice and staying up all night when he has a fever. It means cartoon movies and chicken nuggets and birthday parties at Chuck E. Cheese." Evelyn's voice carried a weariness that spoke to years of single parenting. "It means putting someone else's needs before your own every single day without question or complaint." "You think I can't do that? I think you've never had to do that." Evelyn's tone wasn't accusatory, just realistic. "You've built a life where you answer to no one, where your time is your own, where you can make decisions based purely on what you want. Having a child changes everything." Scott was quiet for a moment, watching Mark bound down the school steps with the energy that only 7-year-olds possessed. "Maybe that's exactly what I need." "Scott, I'm serious. Look at my life, Evie. Really look at it. I have a house I barely live in, cars I don't drive, money I don't spend. I've been so focused on building something that I forgot to build a life." Scott turned back to her, his steel blue eyes intense with conviction. "Maybe what I need is someone else's needs to put first." "Children aren't therapy projects," Evelyn said sharply. "They're not solutions to adult problems or ways to find meaning in your life." "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" Evelyn gathered her purse as Mark approached the cafe window, waving enthusiastically. "You've idealized what we had, Scott. You've turned it into some grand love story that can fix everything wrong with your life. But real love isn't a fairy tale. It's messy and difficult, and sometimes it's not enough." The conversation was interrupted by Mark's arrival, full of stories about his day and excited about a science project involving volcanoes. But Evelyn's words echoed in Scott's mind as they walked to the van, as they drove to Mark's after-school tutoring session, as they navigated the mundane realities of daily life with a child. That evening, Scott sat in his empty mansion, staring at the infinity pool that reflected the desert stars like scattered diamonds. Evelyn was right about one thing. He had idealized their past, had built it into something larger than life in his memory. But she was wrong about his motivations. He wasn't trying to fix his life through Mark and Evelyn. He was trying to remember what it felt like to have a life worth living. The crisis came 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday that started like any other day. Scott was in the middle of a board meeting when his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him glance at the screen. Phoenix Children's Hospital. "Excuse me," he said to the room full of executives, stepping into the hallway to answer. "This is Scott Turner." "Mr. Turner? This is Dr. Sarah Williams from Phoenix Children's Hospital. I'm calling about Marcus Martinez. You're listed as his emergency contact." Scott's blood turned to ice. "What happened? Is he okay?" "Marcus had a seizure at school. His mother is on her way, but she asked us to call you as well. Can you come to the hospital?" "I'm on my way." Scott left the board meeting without explanation, drove through downtown Phoenix with a reckless urgency that would have horrified his insurance company, and burst through the emergency room doors to find Evelyn sitting in a plastic chair, her face white with terror. "Evie." He was beside her before he'd consciously decided to move, his arms around her, shaking shoulders. "What happened? Where is he?" "They're running tests," Evelyn said, her voice hollow with shock. "He was fine this morning, Scott. He ate breakfast, he did his homework, he was excited about the volcano project. And then the school called and said he collapsed in the hallway." "Is this related to his condition?" "I don't know. The doctors are being vague, saying they need to run more tests, that it could be a reaction to his medication or something new entirely." Evelyn pulled back to look at him, tears streaming down her face. What if I did something wrong? What if I missed something? Hey, Scott cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. This is not your fault. You're an amazing mother, Evie. Mark is lucky to have you. I can't lose him, Scott. He's everything. He's my whole world. You're not going to lose him. We're going to figure this out, whatever it takes. We? Evelyn's voice was small, vulnerable. We, Scott confirmed, pulling her back into his arms. I meant what I said about being part of your lives. That includes the scary parts, the hospital visits, the uncertainty, all of it. They waited together for 3 hours, sitting in uncomfortable chairs under fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly and pale. Scott made phone calls, using his connections to get Mark transferred to the best pediatric neurologist in the state. Evelyn held his hand and tried not to think about worst-case scenarios. When Dr. Williams finally emerged with news, her expression was cautiously optimistic. The seizure appears to be an isolated incident, possibly triggered by stress and changes in his medication levels. We're adjusting his treatment plan and want to keep him overnight for observation, but there's no indication of any new complications. Evelyn sagged with relief, and Scott felt something tight in his chest finally loosen. Can we see him? Of course. He's been asking for both of you. They found Mark in a pediatric room decorated with cheerful murals, looking small and pale against the hospital bed, but alert and curious about all the medical equipment surrounding him. His face lit up when he saw them. Mama? Mr. Scott, did you see all the cool machines? The nurse said this one beeps every time my heart beats, and this one shows my breathing and... Slow down, baby, Evelyn laughed, tears of relief mixing with exhaustion. How are you feeling? Tired and hungry. Hospital food is gross. Mark made a face that demonstrated exactly how gross it was. But the doctor said I'm okay. She said my brain just got a little confused for a minute. That's right, Scott said, sitting on the edge of the hospital bed. Your brain just needed a little reset, like when my computer gets overwhelmed and I have to restart it. Mark considered this analogy seriously. So I'm like a computer? You're like the smartest computer in the world, Scott replied, and Mark beamed with pride. Later that evening, after Mark had fallen asleep and Evelyn had dozed off in the chair beside his bed, Scott stood at the window looking out at the city lights. The day had been terrifying, but it had also crystallized something important. This wasn't about fixing his life or recapturing lost love. This was about family, about choosing to love people enough to weather whatever storms came your way. You don't have to stay, Evelyn said quietly, her voice thick with sleep. Scott turned to find her watching him, her dark hair mussed and her eyes soft with exhaustion. Where else would I be? Home, work, your real life. This is my real life, Scott said, surprised by how true the words felt. Sitting in a hospital room at midnight, worried about a little boy who calls me Mr. Scott like I'm someone important. Making sure the woman I love gets some sleep, even if it means I don't. Evelyn sat up straighter at his casual use of the word love, but she didn't correct him or pull away. Scott, I know you're scared, he said, moving to sit in the chair next to hers. I know this is happening fast, and it feels dangerous, and you're not sure you can trust it. But Evie, what happened today, the way I felt when I thought something might happen to Mark, that's not nostalgia or idealization, that's love. Real, present tense, choose to be here, love. He's not your son, Evelyn said, but there was no accusation in it, just a statement of fact that carried years of protective instincts. No, he's not. But he's yours, and you're everything I never knew I was looking for. Scott reached for her hand, threading their fingers together. I can't promise I'll be perfect at this. I can't promise I won't make mistakes, or say the wrong thing, or struggle with parts of parenting I don't understand. But I can promise I'll try every day to be worthy of this. Evelyn studied his face in the dim light of the hospital room, searching for signs of doubt or insincerity. But all she saw was the boy she'd fallen in love with 16 years ago, grown into a man who was finally ready to choose love over safety. Okay, she whispered. the word carrying the weight of 16 years of walls finally coming down. Okay? Okay, let's see what happens when we stop being scared and start being brave. Scott leaned over and kissed her forehead, a gentle promise of all the conversations they still needed to have, all the obstacles they still needed to navigate. But for now, in a hospital room at midnight with the steady beeping of Mark's heart monitor providing a rhythm of hope, it felt like enough. Some love stories begin with grand gestures, others begin with quiet moments of choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. As Evelyn fell back asleep with her hand in Scott's, both of them keeping watch over the little boy who'd become the bridge between their past and their future, they began to understand that the best kind of love wasn't the kind that conquered everything. It was the kind that showed up every day, ready to face whatever came next together. Have you ever had a moment where you realized that love isn't about perfect timing or ideal circumstances, but about choosing to show up when it matters most? Sometimes the biggest declarations happen in the quietest moments. Share your story of unexpected love in the comments below. 6 months into their careful courtship, everything came crashing down on a Thursday afternoon in March. Scott was at his office reviewing the final terms of a major acquisition when Evelyn burst through his door without waiting for his assistant's announcement. Her face was flushed with anger and something that looked like betrayal, a manila folder clutched in her white-knuckled grip. "We need to talk," she said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge that made Janet look up from her desk in alarm. "Evie, what's wrong?" Scott stood immediately, recognizing the signs of the defensive walls he thought they'd finally torn down. "Janet, could you give us a moment?" Janet gathered her files and disappeared into the outer office, closing the door behind her with the discretion of someone who'd learned to recognize emotional emergencies. "This," Evelyn said, throwing the folder onto Scott's desk with enough force to scatter the papers inside. "This is what's wrong." Scott looked down at the contents and felt his blood turn to ice. Private investigator reports, financial documents, medical records, a complete dossier on Evelyn and Mark's life spanning the past 6 months. Every doctor's appointment, every school event, every struggle she'd faced was documented with clinical precision. "Evie, I can explain. Can you? Because it looks to me like you've been having me followed, investigated, catalogued like some kind of business acquisition." Her voice rose with each word, 16 years of fear and defensive anger pouring out in a flood. "Was any of this real, Scott? Or was I just another project for you to manage?" "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" Evelyn picked up one of the reports, her hands shaking as she read from it. "Subject's financial status remains precarious despite assistance. Child's medical condition stable but requires ongoing monitoring. Subject shows signs of emotional attachment to client." She looked up at him with eyes bright with tears and fury. "I'm the subject, Scott. My son is the child. We're not people to you, we're data points." Scott felt the ground shifting beneath him, the careful foundation they'd built together, cracking under the weight of a truth he'd hoped she'd never discover. "It's not like that. I needed to understand." "Understand what? Whether we were worth your investment? Whether Mark and I were good enough for your attention?" Evelyn's laugh was bitter and broken. "God, I'm such an idiot. I actually believed you'd changed, that you were different from every other wealthy man who sees people like me as charity cases or entertainment." "Evelyn, please, let me explain." "Explain what? That you've been manipulating our lives for months? That every coincidence, the better insurance coverage, the scholarship that suddenly became available for Mark's tutoring, the promotion I got at the restaurant, none of it was real?" She was backing toward the door, every instinct screaming at her to run before he could hurt her any worse. "How long have you been pulling strings, Scott? How much of our lives have you orchestrated? I was trying to help by lying to me? By treating me like a puppet?" Evelyn's voice cracked with the pain of someone who'd been betrayed by the person she'd trusted most. "I asked you not to make me feel like charity. I told you I needed to do things myself, to maintain some dignity, and you smiled and nodded and then went behind my back to control everything anyway." Scott moved toward her, desperation making him clumsy. "It wasn't about control. I was protecting you, protecting Mark. I wanted to make sure..." "You wanted to make sure what? That we'd be grateful enough to stay? That we'd be dependent enough that we couldn't leave? Evelyn reached for the door handle, her whole body radiating the need to escape. This is exactly what David did. Maybe he didn't investigate me, but he managed me, manipulated my choices until I didn't know what was real anymore. The comparison to her ex-fiancé hit Scott like a physical blow. I'm nothing like him. You're exactly like him. You're worse than him because at least David was honest about seeing me as a stepping stone. You pretended to love me while treating me like a problem to be solved. I do love you, Scott said desperately. Everything I felt, everything we built together, that was real. Was it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like an elaborate manipulation designed to get what you wanted. Evelyn's tears were falling freely now, but her voice remained steady with the kind of cold fury that came from having your deepest fears confirmed. Did you think I was so pathetic, so desperate, that I'd never figure it out? The investigation started before I found you again, Scott said, grasping for any explanation that might salvage this disaster. I'd been looking for you for years, Evie. When I finally hired the right investigators, they found you 6 months ago. I was working up the courage to approach you when I saw you at the lemonade stand. Evelyn went very still. 6 months ago. I never meant for you to find out like this. I was going to tell you to explain everything, but I wanted to wait until you trusted me enough to understand. Understand what? That our meeting wasn't fate or coincidence, but you stalking me? The betrayal in her voice was devastating. That you showed up at my lemonade stand knowing exactly who I was, knowing about Mark's medical bills, knowing I was struggling. Yes, but get away from me. The words were quiet, but carried the finality of a death sentence. Stay away from both of us. Evelyn, please let me explain why I did it. Let me show you that everything between us was real. Nothing between us was real, she said, her hand on the door handle. It was all based on lies and manipulation, and the same arrogance that every wealthy man seems to think gives him the right to manage other people's lives. What about Mark? You can't cut me out of his life now. He loves me, and I love him. You love the idea of him, the idea of playing savior to a grateful single mother and her sick child. Evelyn's voice was getting stronger, her anger providing the armor she needed to do what had to be done. But you don't get to love him, Scott. You don't get to use a 7-year-old boy as leverage to keep me in your life. That's not what I'm doing. That's exactly what you're doing, and it stops now. Evelyn opened the door, pausing for one last devastating blow. I should have known better. People like you don't fall in love with people like me. You collect us, like trophies or art pieces, something interesting to display when you want to feel good about yourselves. Evie, wait! But she was gone, leaving Scott standing in his office surrounded by the evidence of his own betrayal, the careful reports that had seemed like thorough research, but now looked like the tools of a predator. Janet appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. Should I cancel your afternoon appointments? Cancel everything, Scott said, sinking into his chair. Cancel everything for the rest of the week. Want to talk about what happened? Scott looked at the scattered papers on his desk, each one a violation of Evelyn's privacy and autonomy. I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me because I couldn't trust that she'd choose me without manipulation. Scott, I investigated her, Janet, for months before I approached her. I knew about her struggles, her ex-husband, Mark's medical needs. I knew everything, and I used it to position myself as her savior. Scott's laugh was hollow and self-loathing. She was right. I treated her like an acquisition target instead of a person. What are you going to do? I'm going to leave her alone, like she asked. Scott gathered the papers, shoving them back into the folder, with movements that spoke to barely controlled rage at himself. I'm going to live with the fact that I had everything I ever wanted and threw it away because I couldn't stop being a controlling bastard long enough to just love her. That evening, Scott drove past Evelyn's apartment complex, hoping to catch a glimpse of her or Mark, hoping for some sign that he hadn't completely destroyed the family he'd found and lost in the space of 6 months. But the windows were dark, and the parking space where her van usually sat was empty. They were gone. Over the next 3 days, Scott called every number he had for Evelyn, left voicemails that went unreturned, even drove to the restaurant where she worked, only to be told that she'd quit without notice. It was as if she'd vanished from Phoenix entirely, taking Mark and all hope of redemption with her. On Sunday night, his phone rang with a call from an unknown number. For a wild moment, Scott hoped it might be Evelyn calling from a new phone, ready to listen to his explanations and apologies. Instead, it was Mark's voice, small and confused, and heartbreaking in its innocence. "Mr. Scott, why did you make my mama cry?" Scott closed his eyes, his heart breaking at the pain in the little boy's voice. "Hey, buddy, I made some really big mistakes, and your mama is hurt because of them. She won't tell me what happened. She just keeps crying and packing our stuff." Mark's voice dropped to a whisper. "Are we moving because of you?" "Probably, yes." "But why? I thought you loved us. I thought we were going to be a family." The simple question contained 16 years of longing and 6 months of hope, now shattered because Scott couldn't trust that love was enough without insurance policies and safety nets. "I do love you, Mark. I love you and your mama more than anything in the world, but I hurt her feelings really badly and now she doesn't trust me anymore." "Can't you say sorry? Mama always says sorry fixes things." "Some things can't be fixed with sorry, buddy. Some mistakes are too big." Mark was quiet for a long moment, and Scott could hear muffled voices in the background. Evelyn calling for her son, probably wondering who he was talking to. "I have to go," Mark whispered. "But Mr. Scott, I hope you figure out how to fix it, because Mama was happy when you were around, and I liked having a dad, sort of." The line went dead, leaving Scott alone with the devastating knowledge that he'd lost not just the woman he loved, but the child who taught him what it meant to put someone else's needs first. Some mistakes couldn't be fixed with apologies or money or good intentions. Some betrayals cut so deep that they severed connections permanently, leaving nothing but the memory of what could have been if only he'd been brave enough to trust in love without trying to control it. Scott Turner had built an empire by managing risk and ensuring favorable outcomes. But love, he was learning too late, required the kind of courage he'd never possessed. The courage to be vulnerable, to trust without guarantees, to offer your heart without demanding insurance policies in return. And now, sitting in his empty mansion with the taste of regret bitter on his tongue, Scott finally understood the difference between loving someone and trying to own them. Unfortunately, understanding had come too late to save the only love that had ever mattered. The boy who'd once promised to come back when he had enough money to take care of them both had finally kept his promise, only to discover that all the money in the world couldn't buy back the trust he'd destroyed with his need to control what should have been given freely. Some promises, it turned out, were better broken than kept in the wrong way. 2 months of silence felt like a lifetime. Scott had thrown himself into work with the desperate intensity of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts, closing deals with mechanical precision, while his heart remained locked somewhere in a Phoenix apartment that no longer held the people who'd made it home. He'd tried hiring investigators to find Evelyn and Mark, only to call them off before they'd begun. The irony of using the same methods that had destroyed their relationship wasn't lost on him. Instead, he waited and hoped, and slowly began to understand the difference between loving someone and trying to possess them. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday evening in May, when Janet knocked on his office door holding a small envelope that looked suspiciously like a child's handwriting. "This came to my home address," she said, setting it carefully on his desk. "No return address, but I think you'll want to see it." Scott's hands shook as he opened the envelope, revealing a hand-drawn picture of 3 stick figures standing in front of a house with a crooked chimney and flowers that looked more like colorful scribbles. At the bottom, in Mark's careful 7-year-old printing, "I miss you, Mr. Scott. Love, Mark." On the back of the paper, in Evelyn's familiar handwriting, "Albuquerque General Hospital Children's Wing. He's been asking about you." Scott was in his car before Janet could ask if he needed anything, driving through the Arizona desert toward New Mexico with a single-minded determination that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the family his heart had claimed as his own. He found them in a small hospital room that felt achingly familiar, Mark in a bed that made him look impossibly small, surrounded by the same cheerful medical equipment that had monitored his breathing 2 months ago. But this time, Evelyn sat beside him with an exhaustion that spoke to days of worry and sleepless nights. "Mr. Scott." Mark's face lit up despite the IV lines and monitoring cables, his joy so pure and uncomplicated that Scott felt his chest crack open with love and relief. "You came, I knew you'd come." "Hey, buddy." Scott approached the bed carefully, acutely aware of Evelyn's guarded expression and the way she'd positioned herself protectively between him and their son. "How are you feeling?" "Better now that you're here. The doctors say my medicine needed to be changed again, but they got it figured out." Mark reached out with his free hand, and Scott took it without hesitation. "Mama said we had to move because of her job, but I think it was really because she was sad about you." "Mark," Evelyn said quietly, a warning in her voice. "It's okay, Mama. We talked about this, remember? About how grown-ups sometimes need help figuring out their feelings." Mark looked back at Scott with the serious expression he wore when dispensing wisdom beyond his years. "She still loves you, you know. She just doesn't trust you anymore." The simple, devastating truth hung in the hospital room like a diagnosis. Scott looked at Evelyn, seeing the confirmation in her eyes, even as she tried to maintain her defensive walls. "Can I talk to your mama alone for a minute?" Scott asked Mark. "I have some important grown-up things to discuss with her. Are you going to apologize? Because Mama said you hurt her really bad, and sorry has to be really big when the hurt is really big." "I'm going to try," Scott said honestly, "but some hurts are so big that sorry might not be enough." Mark considered this with the gravity of a child who'd learned that adults didn't always have the power to fix everything. "But trying is important too, right?" "Right." Evelyn followed Scott into the hallway, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. She looked thinner than he remembered, worn down by 2 months of single parenting in a new city while managing Mark's medical needs without a support system. "Thank you for coming," she said formally, as if Scott were any other visitor, rather than the man who'd shared her bed and her dreams for 6 months. "He's been asking about you constantly. I thought maybe if you said goodbye properly it would help him understand that you're not coming back." "Is that what you want? For me to say goodbye?" Evelyn's composure cracked slightly. "What I want doesn't matter anymore. It's the only thing that matters." Scott leaned against the wall, maintaining the distance she clearly needed while fighting every instinct to pull her into his arms. "Evie, I know I destroyed your trust. I know I manipulated and controlled and treated you like a problem to be solved instead of a woman to be loved. I know sorry isn't enough to fix what I broke. Then why are you here? Because Mark asked me to come and because I finally understand the difference between loving someone and trying to own them." Scott's voice was steady, despite the way his heart was hammering against his ribs. "I spent 2 months learning how to love you the way you deserve to be loved, without conditions, without control, without insurance policies to guarantee a favorable outcome." "Scott, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to take me back or give me another chance or pretend that what I did was acceptable." Scott met her eyes, letting her see the raw honesty he'd been too afraid to show before. "I'm asking you to let me prove that I can love you and Mark without needing to manage your lives, that I can support you without manipulating you, help you without controlling you." "How?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "However you'll let me. If that means monthly visits to see Mark, I'll take it. If it means helping with medical bills from a distance while you build a life that has nothing to do with me, I'll do that. If it means loving you both from the other side of the country, while you figure out whether you can ever trust me again." Scott's voice broke slightly. "I'll do that too." Evelyn stared at him, searching for signs of the manipulation and control that had characterized their relationship before. But all she saw was a man who'd learned, perhaps too late, that love required the courage to let go. "The investigation files," she said finally. "Do you still have them?" "I burned them the day you left, all of them, and I fired the investigators with instructions that they were never to contact me or anyone in my organization again about you or Mark." "Why?" "Because they were evidence of everything I did wrong, everything I never want to do again." Scott pushed off from the wall, taking a small step closer, Because loving someone means respecting their right to privacy, to make their own choices, to succeed or fail without interference. And if I fail, if Mark and I struggle and you have the power to help but I don't want your help? The question was a test, and they both knew it. Scott's answer would determine whether he'd truly learned from his mistakes or was simply offering prettier versions of the same controlling behavior. "Then I'll respect your choice and love you through the struggle without interfering," Scott said quietly, "even if it kills me to watch." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, not the angry tears of betrayal, but the complicated tears of someone whose heart was at war with her head. "I don't know if I can do this again, Scott. The trust we had, it took me years to build that with anyone, and you destroyed it in 6 months. I know. I don't know if I'm strong enough to risk loving you again, only to discover that you're still the same man who thinks money can solve everything and control can substitute for faith. I know that too. Then what are you asking of me?" Scott considered the question, understanding that his answer would shape not just their future, but the kind of man he chose to be going forward. "I'm asking you to let me earn back what I lost. Not quickly, not easily, but honestly. I'm asking for the chance to prove that the man who fell in love with you in foster care is still in here somewhere, underneath all the wealth and arrogance and fear. And if I say no? If I decide that the risk is too great and I want you to stay away permanently, then I'll respect that choice and love you from a distance for the rest of my life." Scott's voice carried the quiet conviction of a man who'd finally learned that love sometimes meant sacrifice. "Because wanting what's best for you is more important than wanting you." Before Evelyn could respond, Mark's voice called from the hospital room. "Are you guys done talking? Because I want to show Mr. Scott my volcano project, and visiting hours end at 8. The interruption broke the spell of their conversation, returning them both to the reality of a sick child who needed both his parents, biological and chosen, to focus on his well-being rather than their complicated past. "We should go back," Evelyn said, wiping her eyes. "Evie." Scott caught her hand as she turned toward Mark's room. "Whatever you decide about us, I want you to know that loving you and Mark was the best thing I've ever done with my life. Even if I screwed it up, even if I lost it through my own stupidity, having it at all was worth everything." Evelyn looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. "Scott." "Yeah?" "Ask me again in 6 months. When Mark is stable and we've both had time to figure out who we are without the crisis and drama and intensity." Her voice was soft, but steady. "If you can love us without trying to control us for 6 months, if you can support us without manipulating us, if you can be patient while I learn to trust again, ask me then. And you'll consider it?" "I'll consider it." Evelyn squeezed his hand briefly before letting go. But no promises, no guarantees, no insurance policies. Just faith that maybe 2 people who love each other can figure out how to do it right the second time around. They spent the evening with Mark, who regaled Scott with stories about his new school, his new friends, and the volcano project that had won first place in the science fair. Scott listened with the kind of attention he'd once reserved for billion-dollar deals, understanding that this, sitting in a hospital room being trusted with a child's excitement about baking soda and vinegar, was worth more than every acquisition he'd ever closed. When visiting hours ended, Scott kissed Mark's forehead and promised to visit again soon. He hugged Evelyn carefully, a gesture that held 16 years of love and 2 months of loss and the fragile possibility of redemption. 6 months, she whispered against his shoulder. 6 months, he agreed. Scott drove back to Phoenix that night, with his heart lighter than it had been in months, not because he'd won Evelyn back, but because he'd been given the gift of time to prove he could love her better. There were no guarantees, no promises, no certainty that she'd ever trust him enough to try again. But for the first time in his adult life, Scott Turner understood that the best things in life couldn't be acquired or controlled. They could only be earned through patience, faith, and the kind of love that was brave enough to let go in order to truly hold on. 6 months stretched ahead of him, like a test he was finally ready to take. And somewhere in Albuquerque, a woman and her son were learning to believe that maybe, just maybe, some promises were worth keeping, especially the ones that required both people to be brave enough to change. The boy who'd once promised to come back when he had enough money to take care of them both had finally learned that love wasn't about having enough of anything. It was about being enough, exactly as you were, for the people who mattered most. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very patient and very willing to do the work of becoming the person love required you to be, you got a second chance to prove that some promises were worth a lifetime of keeping. Have you ever had to rebuild trust after breaking it? Sometimes, the greatest love stories aren't about perfect romance, but about people who choose to grow together through their mistakes. What's the biggest second chance you've given or received? Share your story of forgiveness and growth in the comments. Your journey might inspire someone else to believe in the power of second chances.